Okay. So my name is Dennis Steed, and on behalf of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, I want to welcome everybody to today's session. Today, unfortunately, Mr. LaRouche cannot be with us, nor can Helga. What I'm going to do is to read the comments that Lynn made, which were prior to the Friday webcast. And here's what they were. The transatlantic financial system will blow. Nothing can stop that. It is unknown exactly when it will blow, but we must be prepared for that inevitable explosion. The system is beyond management or reform. We are on the edge of an unpredictable blowout. We need a different approach, which must be based on rational parties in the transatlantic region taking appropriate radical steps. Putin understands this crisis, and his perspective, as reflected in his remarks at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, are unmatched. The United States and the United Kingdom are the most unreliable. Obama is the greatest risk of any special bets on the planet. Obama loses, period. A new system of finance is the only option. Intelligent people must realize that speculation will not work. The whole gambling system must be canceled. All gambling debt must be canceled, and we must start all over, but on the basis of different principles altogether. The British system must come to an end, and the post-de Gaulle French system as well. A full global reconstruction is required with no deals. The US-European financial system is impossible. Just say no. We must return to a system based on physical values, not money values. We need to start afresh from a Hamiltonian standpoint. I think people are aware, or if you're not aware, I'll say, that Lynn has been making the point that the policy committee has become an indispensable component of the day-to-day formulation of not just international strategy for our organization, but also for the world as a whole. There are many things that are happening, and there are things that we'll be able to in part address today as well. But I think it's important that we just stay or get the idea that the gathering we're having here right now, which is coming prior to some events that will become more clear in the next week, is a crucial one. What we're going to do coming out of this is crucial. So I'm going to introduce Diane, and she will start us off. And then from there, we'll go to questions and answers. Diane?
Good afternoon. So I'll just say what everyone in this room is responsible for is the direction that the United States is going to go in this extreme moment of tension. And members of the policy committee had a number of discussions with both Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche in the last several days, in which Mrs. LaRouche said that we should mediate or convey the extraordinary tension today in the world between, on the one hand, the dying British Empire typified by Barack Obama, typified by what unfolded in Orlando last week. This week, the week began with Orlando and ended with the assassination of a British member of Parliament, Joe Cox. And their desperate death agony, their murderous death agony, which is putting us in very real danger of a thermonuclear war with Russia, as has been expressed very clearly by Russia expert Stephen Cohen on The Bachelor show, where he said that the impeachable crime of the current Obama administration is that they are refusing to work with Russia. Russia, under Putin in particular, has demonstrated its expertise at defeating terrorism. But we in the United States, under Obama as a tool of the British Empire, are participating in a provocation of Russia in exercises which have placed 40 to 50,000 troops on Russia's border, just concluded going into a NATO summit with the outrageous propaganda that somehow Putin and Russia, the experts on crushing ISIS and fighting terrorism, are actually the leading threat on the planet, which nothing could be further from the truth. And what you have here is Prince Salman of the Saudi royal family, who should frankly not even be allowed into the United States, and probably his other family members should be on trial for their roles in the 9/11 attacks. He has been in New York, in Washington, on the West Coast, back to Washington, back to New York, demonstrating the problem. The issue is that the system is completely bankrupt, as Dennis just said. And there were reports going into the Friday webcast that both Wells Fargo and Bank of America are once again in their subprime lending mode, which people may remember was happening in 2007 before the crash of 2008. A crash today would be far, far greater, because the very banks that caused the crash before are about 30% larger now, thanks to all of the bailouts. And the actual real economy has been rooted that much more by these bailouts, so that we are in a much more precarious situation. What you have coming into being is epitomized by the St. Petersburg Forum, which has been occurring these last 3 days with leaders from all over the world, including Exxon from the United States breaking the policy from Obama of the sanctions, nations who want to work with Russia, who recognize what LaRouche said is exactly on the mark. Betting on Obama is a loser. Obama is a loser. This will not work. The British system will not work. It cannot be safe. The only thing working on the planet is what has emerged with the leadership of Russia and China in the BRICS, which is moving at an ever accelerating pace, which is spreading optimism even in the United States as we get reflections of this coming into our country. And the question, I think, for all of us is the challenge: how do we break the United States from the British Empire, from the British Saudi Empire, the people who ran 9/11, to instead work with this new paradigm and this new BRICS process? And I just would say, I think it's urgent that people take very personally that this is not business as usual. This is not the crisis that has been going on and going on. All you have to do is look at last week, from Orlando to the Joe Cox assassination, which has led, by the way, in Britain, that they declared a moratorium on campaigning for or against the Brexit. The Brexit vote occurs on June 23rd. And it's not so much a matter of will it help anything or won't it help anything, that depending on which way it goes, David Cameron could be out. Scotland and Ireland could leave Great Britain. In other words, there are big, big changes in the making, and therefore everything we do in this crucial period is going to be absolutely decisive. And that's the quality of tension that everybody here should take into their heart and radiate as we organize into the coming days.
So just for anybody that may be here for the first time, just to make sure it's clear, when you come to the podium for a question, please state the question shortly, and then we'll have Diane will answer, and there will be a follow-up. If there's something that I elect to answer because she doesn't need to do it, I'll do it, and then we'll just take up the questions from there. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Michelle Rasmussen. I'm with the LaRouche organizers and the Schiller Institute organizers in Denmark. And just for a short visit here, in Denmark, we have a small but active group. And right now, we have made a significant intervention in the light of the increasingly threatening NATO maneuvers. It should be said that in the NATO maneuvers, where there's an increasing, the plan is up until the NATO summit meeting in July to increase NATO troops in the Baltic countries, in Poland, and to make a hysteria that the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. And these maneuvers in themselves could provoke war, could provoke nuclear war. So in this light, we have been intervening with our petition to dismember NATO. And in Denmark, we were fighting in the 1980s, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, for a strong NATO to consolidate and strengthen the Western alliance at a time when the Soviet Union had aggressive plans on Western Europe. But the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. And there should have been a new economic and security architecture, but there was not. And Denmark, a small country, but has been going along with the war policy. The Danish troops went to Afghanistan, then to Libya, then to Iraq, then to Libya, then to Syria, now in Syria. And now the Danes are going to be sending troops to Estonia. This past few days, there was the largest political meeting in Denmark. It's called the People's Meeting, where there's a gathering of 30 to 40,000 people. Almost all the parliamentarians, all the ministers from the prime minister on down are there. And then thousands of just interested, politically concerned citizens who assemble in a very small place in an island in the middle of the Baltic Sea called Bornholm. So our people were there intervening with signs which said on the front, nuclear war question mark, Denmark, exit NATO now. And on the back we had our very famous election poster, win-win with the BRICS, not war or collapse. And two significant interventions were, one, at a meeting where there was the British ambassador to NATO and the Polish ambassador, where we distributed literature, there were no questions allowed. And then the other intervention was at a debate organized by the Danish Defense Academy with the Danish military representative to NATO, the Danish permanent ambassador to NATO. And their message was, we have to contain Russia, we have to contain China. Our people got the first question and they said, Denmark should leave NATO, we have to avoid nuclear war, and we have to have cooperation with Russia and China, and cooperation with the rest of the world. So my question is, right now there are increasing signs from Europe, especially from Germany, from France, and from Italy, of opposition to the war and confrontation policy with Russia. And what effect would having the increasing opposition to this policy in Europe have towards preventing the NATO war plan, have towards the ability to prevent war, nuclear war?
Well, I think there's two aspects. One thing you said reminded me of something important, which I think should be said here, which is that Mr. LaRouche referenced that the reason why we are in this situation now is because his policy, the Strategic Defense Initiative, was not followed through. It was sabotaged by the British, by a British intervention onto the leadership of the then Soviet Union. And just prior to adopting LaRouche's policy, people remember there was an assassination attempt against Ronald Reagan. And I think it's worth reflecting what Mr. LaRouche was proposing in terms of the Strategic Defense Initiative, because it wasn't simply laser defense. It was a driver of scientific progress. It was thought of in the way that the famous German scientist Kraft Erika thought of man's imperative to go to explore the universe, to get control of the galaxy. And the idea was that we would cooperate with the then Soviet Union, Russia, on the development of a means to make nuclear weapons obsolete. And this is why Ronald Reagan supported this policy, being from an older generation. As President Kennedy had earlier, he had a profound understanding that man cannot afford the risk of thermonuclear war. It is also the case that man cannot afford the risk of not having scientific progress, because man is a noetic species. That is, we do not change our species by sprouting wings or growing tails, although I do have questions about some of our politicians. But at any rate, there may be other things they're trying to hide inside their clothes than what people think. But at any rate, man transforms his species through scientific discovery. So the rejection of the SDI was not only a sabotage of the potential for the United States and Russia to collaborate, but was a sabotage of a potential spectacular economic recovery. And as people may recall, when the Berlin Wall came down, I will never forget it. Bush Sr., who was, I think he had asthma and he was always really whiny. And there were all these pictures of people dancing. I mean, it was a really joyous moment. And he said, "You won't see me dancing on the Berlin Wall." And that just made such an impression when he said that. And then what did they do? We had the war in the Balkans, and we had the Iraq war. In other words, everything was done to sabotage it. And then 10 years later, Mr. LaRouche's dialogue with Putin began, where LaRouche produced the extraordinary documentary Storm Over Asia, outlining exactly the strategy, and Putin was brought in to crush the terrorist rising in Chechnya. So I think it's very important to remember this dynamic between LaRouche and Mrs. LaRouche, their fight for a new economic order for mankind, and then what Putin has been doing in his own way coming to this moment. So Mrs. LaRouche also reported in Europe that we're getting a much higher recognition of the danger of war. And I think that's extremely important and significant. I also think that, not to be pessimistic, but we have to think strategically that the people who are pushing this don't care about public opinion. They'll do what they think they can get away with. And so in a sense, what's on our side is the reality of the financial blowout, and the reality that they actually could not, and this is a really bizarre way to put it, but what Obama and NATO are threatening, they don't have the ability to do. It's a bluff. We are so destroyed. Now, that doesn't mean they couldn't cause thermonuclear war, because Russia and China will be forced to respond to what we are doing. But we're part of the reason they're so desperate to launch is they're up against an economic limitation. And therefore, what happens in the short term is very decisive. So I think the significance of the opposition, and we're seeing it here in Manhattan as well. People who've been out in the streets recently know that we have many, many people signing. Hold on. Sorry, signing our petition to leave NATO. But that is not ultimately, it's not sufficient. And I think the question of what happened, I'm sorry, I'm a little under the weather, what happened on September 11th, and the question of getting the truth of that matter is a very important flank. And it's a very important flank both here and in Europe, because I think another factor driving the European crisis is the refugee situation, which is a direct result of the policy of the wars that you mentioned, which was started in an accelerating way after September 11th. So I think it's very important. I think the resistance in the population is important. I think it's important that we're getting a shift in the United States. But we're going to have to take it up even to a higher level. And I think part of that is also making very clear to Americans and to Europeans what the potential actually is in terms of not only defeating thermonuclear war, but actually organizing a renaissance, which is what LaRouche's SDI policy would have led to.
Yes, hi. This is Alvin, and speaking of flanks, a very peculiar thing happened this week that I hadn't seen before, and I've been in New York all my life, and that was since the Orlando massacre, no one in my circle or work circle and within contacts was willing to say a word at all about it. And out of all the number of these types of, in various degrees, terrorist attacks, massacres, whatever you want to call them, this was the first time I saw a complete mute button on for people. And I was kind of stymied by that, and unfortunately spent a couple of days thinking about that instead of realizing that there was a flank available to me. And I began using it over the past couple of days, and that's our concerts and our music. And through opening that up with people that some have attended, others would be looking to attend, but to increase that, that was my opening to then ask them. I said, well, why are we doing this? The same way the Messiah began on the night of those 2 policemen being assassinated, that was actually an opportunity to have people think about what they need to do for themselves and about themselves. And so with that, then immediately going into the EIR overview to blow the lid and to redivert their attention to the British, Saudi, FBI, 9/11 access, going straight from an invitation to music, where they say, well, this feels very overwhelming to me. And I said, well, that's why we sing, and that's why you need to participate in that. And so that flank was available. It took me a couple of days to figure it out, because I was thinking about, how do you talk to people that don't want to talk about something? Well, this was the way to pull them in. And this also includes a bit of Helga's as well. And this was all done in a matter of a few minutes. You just go right into it with them. But it was the music and the idea of a concert that opened that up. So I just wanted to bring that out, something that came to me a little later in the week, and see what any response to that.
When Keisha Rogers recently was in San Francisco, she gave a presentation, which is in our new EIR, and it's called A Whole New Conception of Mankind. And in the course of her presentation, she said this. She said, Mr. LaRouche has long understood this. What we need right now is a transformation of our identity as a human species. And the best way to achieve that is through the understanding of mankind's role in the exploration and conquest of space. Later on, Keisha said, why is it that Kraft Erika, the German space pioneer, was a great collaborator of ours and someone who became very close to Mr. LaRouche and Mr. LaRouche's thinking and to our movement's thinking concerning the policy that governs the understanding of space exploration. He says, and then she said, it governs not just space or exploration, but the destiny of who we are as a species, as mankind. And she says, what is fascinating about Erika is that he did not believe in or accept the conditions of being practical or of doing that which is acceptable per se. He had a different concept, a different philosophy to understand and govern the relationship upon nations, people, and the cosmos and the solar system as a whole. He put forward the conception of nations moving from their understanding of the limitations of a single planet, a one globe planet, to a polyglobal world. Now, if we are going to defend ourselves as a nation or as human beings, we have to look at what Russia, China, and other nations are doing to initiate what Kraft Erika understood. It goes on. Now, The only thing I would say, in addition to what Keisha points out there, and the conception of why this idea of Kraft Erica and the space program is so important, is if you look at something like the events around Orlando, for example, why were the people there at 2 a.m. in the morning? That's not to blame them for getting killed for being there. That's not my point. But why were they there? And what were they doing? And the issue is not gay or not gay, any of that. Why were they there and what were they doing? Why are our people in the United States doing what they are doing? It's because of the way they think. They're not thinking about the idea of the galaxy. They're not thinking about the idea of the solar system. They're not thinking about the idea of human progress, really. But they've been not just dumbed down, but they've been terrorized in a particular way. And the significance of what Keisha is doing, and has been called upon by Mr. LaRouche to do, is, since she was also the leader of the campaign against Obama in her campaigns in Texas, she was qualified by doing that, and because of her own background from earlier, to lead the campaign around the resurrection of the space program. So this is the idea that at least the LaRouche movement has consistently represented on the issue of culture. Culture is a living action. It's not a passive process. But it has to also be directed. And so that intervention that Keisha is involved in is, I think, the way to think about how in a crisis to respond and not be caught up in the apparent drama of particular events. Whatever else Orlando is, we've said a lot about it. The point is, what's the conception of man that people in the United States need to adopt in order that we can play our role with respect to the future of the human race, the role that really the United States and Hamilton's idea of the United States was intended for.
Thank you.
I just want to add one thing, which will be very brief of necessity. We just held a Musikabend in Boston, and it was extraordinarily successful. The room was completely packed, and one of the participants, with many new people who did not know us before, one of the participants there reflected, he said, what you're doing is rebellious because you're rejecting modernism and fighting for classicism, which was the only way clearly that he knew how to reflect it. But I think that you're right in identifying this question of the music as a very powerful way of transforming people to be able to think about the crisis from the appropriate level.
Hello. So I was in Washington, D.C. 2 weeks ago. It's not on? Hello? Okay. Now it's on. So I attended 2 weeks ago, I was in Washington, D.C. to attend celebrations, events around the Indian Prime Minister's visit to United States, which was tremendous. And at a event which featured the U.S. ambassador to India, the Indian ambassador to U.S., and former other diplomats and scholars, a former Indian ambassador to Australia he brought up the Chabahar port development that India is doing with Iran. And he said that India is very clear that the threat of terrorism does not come from Islam, it comes from Wahhabism. It comes from the Saudi ideology. And this was before Orlando or anything. And he said that therefore India knows that working with Iran and working with these regions is a way to stop terrorism. So that was very interesting. And, I was reflecting on that how is exactly Wahhabism spread? It's not just funding of terrorists. It's actually because I was reminded of a deployment in Canada a couple of years ago when we were organizing in Toronto, where a lot of Saudi students study. And we had a table attacking the Saudi, the Saudis did 9/11 and Benghazi. And a few Saudi kids came up from rich oligarchical families, and he said, hey, do you have any, because they thought we're students at Toronto University, and he said, do you have any idea that the Saudi king gives hundreds of millions of dollars to your university? I'm like, no, I didn't know, but thanks for bringing it up to me. Yeah, and why does he give hundreds of millions of dollars to a university? So I started looking into it, and I was reminded about that last week when the Indian ambassador brought it up. And if you look into it, just publicly Google it, the Saudi kingdom gives hundreds of millions of dollars to Harvard, Yale, Rutgers, Arkansas University, various universities. This is a country with 30% illiteracy rate. 30% of its population can't read, and they're giving $800 million to Harvard. So, it's absurd. And you have a lot of revolt in academia about it. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because this is the control. This is what we are up against. What 28 pages and the fight will expose and break is the control, that the control and the way the society has been artificially set up. And our fight is to liberate America from this nightmare, which is, so I don't really have a question, but that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, next.
Good afternoon. My name is Clive Bishop. I'm from the tiny Caribbean country of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which is part of the CARICOM countries. I have a question, but I must give you a background to the situation that gives rise to this question. Now, basically, we're an agricultural country of very rich volcanic soils and abundant fresh water. We have very willing and able and knowledgeable farmers. And our history is one of a diversified agriculture where we produce enough for local consumption as well as export. So much so that our agriculture contributed about between 18 and 20% of our GDP up to 1998. We had a very low food import bill up to 1998, and we had very little non-communicable diseases among our people. Today, everything has changed 180 degrees. Right now, agriculture provides about 6% at most of GDP. Our once lucrative banana export market to United Kingdom and the European Union is almost nil. Our food import bill has galloped to over $150 million US per year. We have a population of just 110,000 residents. Okay? Non-communicable diseases are so prevalent that our health system cannot cope with them. A lot of people have amputated legs, arms, and so on. High blood pressure, diabetes, you name it. That's prevalent. What has happened is that the medical system in the region has found that this is directly linked to the consumption of low-quality imported foods, and also of foods that has some GMO products in it. Now, we have heard in...
Excuse me, the only problem is this. This is something we could discuss later in detail, but if you have a statement or a question...
I'm coming to
please.
the question, right?
Okay.
Yeah, it's right. We are being bombarded now by what is called a Zero Hunger Initiative as part of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. This is pushed by the FAO and I think it's the United Nations, right? I've been asked since I'm here by people at whom we're concerned, because at the same time, our government is pushing a bill, hurrying a bill through Parliament to regulate the importation of GMO foods. So we want to find out if it is possible that the people who are pushing the Zero Hunger Initiative are the same people who are linked to big corporations who are producing the GMOs. Because a lot of our land is in Vincent idle, and we would much prefer to produce our own food as much as possible than have to have this imported food, which is, not accepted by the vast majority of our people. Thank you.
Okay. Let me just say first about St. Vincent that it was a territory that was appropriated by the British East India Company in 1763. It was as a result of a war, sometimes in the United States called the French-Indian War, but actually a war between the French and British empires in which the East India Company became the dominant process, which defined not only the British Empire, but it also defined the conditions under which the American Revolution had to occur. Sometimes Mr. LaRouche has made the point that the actual final battle against the East India Company has not yet been waged, that the American Revolution was an important victory, but that the British Empire and the British imperial system has never been finally defeated. And it is exactly that to which we are dedicated. And that is exactly what he, and why I believe he emphasizes the role of Alexander Hamilton. Now, specifically, Hamilton's work on economy in establishing the science of physical economy and doing many things in the 4 papers that he wrote on credit, the national bank, the constitutionality of the bank, and on manufactures, intend to create the liberation of people. It's not, these aren't technical. They come from a conception of freedom, which Hamilton exemplified, and which the United States used to exemplify. But the problem is the domination of the globe by a British imperial system, which Barack Obama is the central expression of. Now, the problem that people have whenever you bring this up is they refuse to recognize that Barack Obama is the primary agent of genocide, generally against people throughout the globe, but specifically against Black, brown people, and so on in the world. He is the central agent, perpetrator, and deployer of genocide. So while it's true that the GMO question is an important one and it's being used by a lot of people against a lot of people, fundamentally, the solution to any of the problems that we're facing, and anybody is facing any place in the world, begins and ends, in effect, with the removal of Barack Obama from office. Now, the reason that's not a cop-out, just to say, I'm not because I think I have to rationalize that, but see, there's a great deal of fear in identifying Obama as what he is. He is an agent of the British imperial system. Every war that the United States has been involved in particular since the Second World War, has been a product of its capitulation to the British imperial system. And the general war that we find right now that's going on, in which all corners of the world have been involved, means that what people in this meeting, in this gathering in Manhattan, have to face is here in America. The removal of Obama is the most important contribution that any of us can make to any other part of the world. So it's I think, important just to say that there isn't any way to deal with the situation there in St. Vincent without first looking at the context. It's a colony. It's been a colony. Yeah, it's always been a colony. And the problem involved is that the overthrow of the colonial mentality is something that is our job, and it begins with and will happen with the removal of Obama from office. Yeah.
I'm Al Corby. For people who are not aware of who we are, who are seeing us for the first time at a table or with our banners out on the street, we're asking who are we and what our purpose is. Our purpose is to bring about a renaissance, not hope and pray that it'll happen. We welcome people from all over the world who want the same thing. And it means hard work. Some say it's impossible. We say it's necessary, and we intend to do it. Why? Because we want the reward that we have accomplished it. Perhaps all of us can remember a time when we had a different job to do, that we weren't sure we had to and we were able to do, and then suddenly the answer came on like a light going inside us, the discovery that we were able to do it, the joy of accomplishment. I think that's human. So let's have pity on those who are unable to experience that joy because of a crippled mentality, or those that believe that they need to feed off the crumbs that a sick empire feeds them. There's no place for them in our normal human world that we intend to bring about. Our reward will be that satisfaction, that joy of accomplishment that is human. Is that what Lyndon LaRouche means when he often ends his presentation with, "Let's have fun"?
Hi, my name's Adam from Long Island. So on the way here, I read an article about the unexpected resignation of the head of India's central bank. Apparently, it was unannounced. He was a former IMF chief economist, and he's credited with stabilizing their economy and bringing inflation down, and overall cleaning up corruption in their economy. And he was ousted for no particular reason, effective September 4th. I'm wondering, the person that called for his, Mr. Modi, Sabrahim Swamy, sent a letter to President Modi saying he's not fully Indian mentally. It sounds like there's no reason for him to resign here. I'm wondering if you think this is part of an attack on the BRICS by the Western countries, because India is such a large source of gold, and that they have it in their possession as opposed to with us. So I'm wondering if this is a Western-backed move to take control of India's, your opinion on it, economy.
Well, I don't have the full intelligence, and I'm not an authority, but he's not ousted, he's resigning after his term is over, September 4th. And he has been attacked from within Modi's political party, although Modi has openly said that he supports Rajan's policies. But you have within India a lot of partisan politics, which, Modi joked about that when he spoke at the Congress, where Modi, during the congressional session, he said to the Congress that I've heard that you guys are known for your bipartisanship. And so are we. So this is a battle, and this is a battle, which is not resolved, but it's a fight. So I don't know what the future is for the central bank, but that's all that I know about. So.
I think Avneet is well informed on that particular situation, but I just really want to underscore what we said at the beginning and what Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche have been saying, that is, this system is finished. The transatlantic system is finished, and we're at a moment of extreme change. Whether this is an indication of that or not, I'm not going to speculate, but I think it's very important that because I think as Americans, we have a tendency to think that we actually control everything in the world, and we don't. We've lost that ability if we ever had it. There was a certain factor of inspiration when we've had great presidents, whether it was going back as far as John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, Kennedy, Franklin Roosevelt, where nations would want to be like us because of a certain quality of mission and leadership that emanated from the United States. But in the last period, it is actually the case that Putin has a much greater role and influence on international policy than Obama. I mean, I hate even to say that. It's so ridiculous to think of. All that Obama has is that people are afraid that he's such an insane lunatic that he could get us into thermonuclear war. But he is not a policy shaper. He is a losing bet. And the policy globally is being shaped by what Putin is doing in particular, and also the role that China is playing with their spectacular commitment to scientific progress, including the plan to land on the far side of the moon in 2018 and everything associated with that, which has a similar inspirational quality to what the United States used to have. So I just think it's extremely important that we keep in mind that many of us have axioms which we may not be fully conscious of, that the British Empire and Obama have more power than they do right now, and we underestimate what President Putin actually is orchestrating.
Rick from Bergen County, New Jersey. Dennis mentioned genocide, and indeed, genocide is occurring in the world. I read in the New York Times several days ago that there's a group of about 400,000 people in both Syria and Iraq called the Yazidi people, with their separate religion. And ISIS is apparently, according to UN reports, is attempting to genocidally exterminate every one of these people. We're talking about 400,000 people. So that's one form of genocide that's occurring in the world right now. On another note, I was encouraged by Elliot's work with the scholar Stephen Cohen, who seems to have improved his position or changed his position in a positive direction recently in an article in The Nation magazine. I won't go through the details. However, you know, things like that are happening at a glacial pace, where when you are a captive of ISIS, I mean, your life is probably going to end in minutes. And we have a thing in Congress to read into the congressional record, the 28 pages, and it seems that Congress is dragging its feet on this issue. When you're in a position where every 10 minutes, thousands of people are getting killed, it should take on a certain type of urgency, which I don't see. So my question is, how do we develop a sense of urgency to get the Congress to vote for that resolution in order to put into the congressional record the 28 pages?
Well, I think the best way, frankly, to answer that, I'm going to ask in a minute that John Segerson say something. And I'll tell you why I'm going to ask that John say something in response to that. See, you just said a few things concerning the lack of the sense of urgency, that there are thousands of people being killed and someone in Congress should act. Do you feel that sense of urgency? Do the people in this room feel that sense of urgency? Because actually, you don't have to be a member of the Congress to have the kind of impact that actually stops these things from happening. Now, this is exactly where we have our big problem with the American people. In other words, you know, the LaRouche movement is not popular. True, our members, and sometimes we like to think we're popular, because if you're out on the street corner and you're sort of out there, you don't know they're all strangers, you hope that they like you. But the truth of the matter is that we're very unpopular, and we remain that way. And the reason is that Lyndon LaRouche has always insisted that what he is doing is, in fact, at the center of changing the world. Now, you know, a lot of people don't think that that is true. But why don't they think it's true? It's interesting, because when you look at his actual record, both as a forecaster and just in terms of what he's actually done in collaboration with people like Ronald Reagan or Lopez Portillo of Mexico or others, and you also look at his collaborators over time, people like Croft Erica or the violinist Norbert Breineen or the vocal coach Sylvia Olden-Lee or people like William Warfield or many other people we could cite, scientists and others. it's obvious that in some fashion, he has proven that that is correct. But the problem with the American citizen is that the American citizen insists he's not an American citizen. He insists he is a subject. But Lynn also says to us often, but that's not exactly, that's not something we can complain about. It's our role, it's our task to change that in this country. Now, Putin, Diane just said, Putin and the strategic crisis that confronts us in the world is not the one that Americans think. The strategic crisis that confronts Americans is Barack Obama, who is a satanic figure. But the problem is you can't confront a satanic figure if you have a problem with Satanism yourself. If you're involved in some form of little satanic activity on your own, then what happens is the big satanic activity just looks too overwhelming to you to deal with. My point in identifying this thing on Orlando was not the people. I mean, frankly, the people at Disney World are in a bit of the same situation as the people who are in the gay club. That's right, that's what I said. That the people who are at Disney World, what's the difference? Because in other words, what confronts the country? Why are any Americans doing anything other than campaigning for the removal of Barack Obama, given the number of people that are dying in the United States because of Barack Obama? People say, well, they don't believe that. No, it's not that they don't believe it. It's that they're too frightened and they won't take responsibility for what they believe, but we can't complain about that. LaRouche insists that his people not complain about that, that we let ourselves off the hook. So the reason I'd like to have John say something here about a project we have going on, people know about our chorus, of course, but there's a very specific project that we've talked about a bit here before, and it involves the singing of the Mozart Requiem, is because we've got to do something, in my view, to get our citizens together so that the excuses that we're giving for allowing crime to go on, that we have the capacity to stop, are dampened, and that the mobilization of the inner, or we sometimes call it the better angels of our nature, is sometimes called, right? It is something that becomes accessible to the citizen. It does take great ideas to do that. Mr. LaRouche keeps talking about Albert Einstein, and you have to think like Einstein. And people they react, well, I have no idea how Einstein thought. Well, but that's how you have to think. And so we've been trying through the Manhattan Project to find ways to give people access to that quality of genius, which is actually available to them. So John, could you say something at this point about what we've been doing?
Let me attempt to put a fine point on what Dennis was just saying. If the people who were at that, anybody who was at that nightclub, right, anybody who goes to Disney World and so forth, even if they knew, maybe they've heard the Mozart Requiem, they haven't really understood it. What I would say is that once you understand and you actually live the Mozart Requiem and the classical culture that was characterized by people, these individuals, these incredibly creative individuals like Mozart and Beethoven, who were very political, by the way, that emotionally, these things, these kinds of degraded activities, gambling, going to nightclubs, all these kinds of things, entertainment in general, right, is just really becomes rather meaningless emotionally to one. One is rather gripped by something which I would like to just say is a purpose. And the problem today with a lot of people who attempt to delve into classical, so-called classical music, is that much of the classical music that's been done, especially since the death of the great German conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler, a lot of the classical music that's been done since then has lacked that purpose. Rather, it has been a form of refined entertainment for the people who like to feel good, to go home at a concert feeling good in one way or another. And so in a certain way, it's a kind of refined nightclub experience for a lot of people. We founded the Schiller Institute. I was a founding member in 1984 with Helga Zepp LaRouche. And part of one of the included intents of the Schiller Institute was to change that and to return to a real idea of classical culture. Now, when I say classical, maybe some people might be confused. So let me just use a way of putting that that Lyndon LaRouche frequently would like to do. He would, in contrasting the romanticism of, say, a Richard Wagner to the classicism of, say, a Beethoven, a beautiful Beethoven symphony, he would say that, well, with Wagner, you don't leave a dry seat in the house. As opposed to with Beethoven, you don't leave a dry eye in the house. Because that really is it. Because classical does not mean a period of music and a period of time. You know, you had the Baroque and you had the classical and then you had the post-classical and then you had the Romantic and all this stuff. That's meaningless. Classical is an idea, it's a concept, it's a principle. It's a principle of a way of thinking, which is why this question of Einstein comes up. The reason, I mean, one of the ways that Einstein would figure things out is once he reached a certain kind of impasse in his thinking, in his working out of problems, he would put down his whatever he was writing implements and whatever he was working on, and he would pick up his violin and he would play, usually Bach, but also Mozart as well. And that was the way that he would be able to work these paradoxes through. Because one of the things about classical music that's different than any other kinds of music is that it implicitly imposes a paradox, which in order for you to solve, you have to have an idea of a purpose. And as Schiller pointed out in a lot of his aesthetic writings, when you do a concert or something like that, any kind of event, you have failed if you just send people back feeling good and feeling sort of elevated. We went to one of these events just the other day with the big sing up there at the St. John the Divine, and sang a lot of good music there with this huge, how big was that chorus? How many people? 400 or 500 people there singing. A lot of this was part of the choral consortium, and it was a lot of not bad music, including some Bach pieces. And there were certain platitudes that were said by each of the conductors about Orlando and so forth, but clearly people left there, by and large, outside of the people whom we talked to, about the idea of doing a memorial for the 9/11. Outside of that, most people just went having that warm, fuzzy feeling. The first time, let me talk about the Requiem just a little bit. The first time that we performed the Requiem was shortly after the Schiller Institute was founded in 1984, when in October 1984, there was the assassination of Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, whom both Lyndon and Helga had met with and were friends with. Since then, it has always been my intent and our intent never to do a requiem just for the sake of doing a piece of music. A requiem is a very very special kind of celebration of the life of the individual and what the life of the individual after his mortal remains have passed. And you need to focus on an individual. And in that case, it was Indira Gandhi, and we did that, and we really freaked people out when we did that. A lot of for many of the enemies of the LaRouche movement, the FBI, people who were dedicated to stopping everything that LaRouche represented, this was sort of like the last straw, and it was shortly after that that many of the real attacks and the legal attacks and the jailings and the frame-ups occurred in the late 1980s and the 1990s, which sent Mr. LaRouche and many of our associates to jail for a number of years. We're past that, but we continue to think about and to rebuild that idea of the Mozart Requiem as a very important instrument for the uplifting of human beings, to give them an idea of what it really means to be human, so that once you leave a concert, if it's successful, you leave the concert having made a decision to change. If you haven't decided to change, if the concert has not changed you, I mean, nowadays people say they're moved, but really what does that mean? It means that if you were really moved, you're moved to change the way you think, to reject something that may have been very dear to you, but you realize that it's inferior, and so you have to get rid of it, like smoking or something, or drugs, or something else that you have to give up, because you found that there's something higher, there's something more important. So the second time that we did the Mozart Requiem was, I think, 2.5 years ago in Boston. We, again, this had a great purpose, which was the memorializing of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It was really quite remarkable at that time because we found that nobody else was doing anything about this. There was nobody else who really was saying, I mean, there were a couple of people saying a few things, but nobody was really celebrating who Kennedy was and what he represented and the kind of hope that he represented for getting, for developing the entire world, the entire world economy. And that was a very successful concert that we gave up in Boston at the Holy Cross Cathedral. To a full audience of 1,200 at that cathedral. We also did a performance of it around that same time in Northern Virginia, which was also quite interesting because of various, and we decided not to do it right inside Washington, D.C. when we found that we had a much better response outside of Washington. Surprise, surprise. We are now in the process of putting together something which is yet bigger, which is a series of concerts of the Mozart Requiem, one after the other, over the series of days around the weekend of 9/11, which is the 15th anniversary of 9/11. 9/11 happens to be itself falling on a Sunday. And we are going to be performing the Requiem as part of a celebratory mass at a major church. I don't know if I should talk about the details right here, but it's still under negotiation, but it's going to be in a major church in Brooklyn. And it will be celebrating this is part of a celebration that has been done every year at that church in memory of the battalion of firefighters who were in that area. This was in an area which is rather close to Manhattan, and this battalion, when they heard about 9/11, they heard about the towers, they immediately rushed in to the buildings, and all of them, the entire battalion, died in that day. So this is something that's going to be a very important statement. But we're also going to be having performances in almost every other borough in Manhattan on other days around that time. That's the intent. And the other intent to do it is, as I said, in a way that's not just celebrating, it's going to be political in the way that we're talking about. That is, it's going to, there's no way nowadays, especially with what's happened in Orlando and what's going on with the 28 pages and the incredible fight that's now really bursting in Congress. There's no way that you can say that these things are apolitical. I mean, hopefully, let us hope that by the time we do that performance in 9/11, Obama will have already been gone. That would be a very good celebration. I encourage those people who have not participated with our chorus to participate. We're openly inviting people to join in and work on the Mozart Requiem over the summer. We have many people who are not, who we've met over the last few weeks, who are very interested in coming in, maybe even bringing their whole choruses in. So this could be, we could end up with a quite large chorus as long as people come to the rehearsals so that they can actually do it properly. I think that's what I want to say right now. It's going to be a really big deal doing these, and it's going to make an incredible impact throughout the metropolitan area and around the world, as far as I can see, because we're going to be doing probably the only thing that I mean, there will probably be other very emotional ceremonies going on at 9/11, but I think what we're doing is going to raise that to the highest level, which is what we have to do, so that we really give meaning to the lives of every single human being's lives, a person who was slaughtered on that day 15 years ago.
So, you going to say something? Go ahead.
I just wanted to add one thing. Yesterday, there was an article on the front page of the New York Times, which was, and it's that version, which is interesting. They do this funny thing where 24 hours later, they rewrite these articles. But the version that was there yesterday was really quite compelling. It was the story of the about to occur funeral that was finally occurring of Captain Stack, a man in Long Island who was the chief, the fireman chief in his battalion in Massapequa. And I'm bringing this up because the person who wrote the article was obviously so overwhelmed with trying to describe it was almost incoherent. But the story did escape from the incompetence of the New York Times reporter. And this is a man whose family decided that they would wait 15 years to see if they could get remains for his body so that they could hold a traditional Catholic funeral, which requires that there be remains. And the only way they could do it was when finally a company that stores blood donations realized that they had 123 donations of firemen who had died that day. And so they contacted all the families and sent the samples to the families so that in these cases people could hold funerals now having a remain of their deceased. But the reason the article was so amazing is it actually described the moment that he died. And this is absolutely chilling because this is a man who, when he woke up that morning, went to work and started doing a very intensive investigation of a fire that had killed 3 other firemen 2 weeks before. And he was sitting at his desk working this through to figure out what had gone wrong. And as he was sitting there, the towers were hit. So he just turned around to everybody in the company and he said, let's go, they're going to need us. And when they got there, they started walking into the Marriott Hotel. And when he went into the Marriott Hotel, there were people who were reaching out and grabbing from under the rubble, grabbing at the feet of the firemen. And this one person, he and his assistant were determined. There were a lot of businessmen from all over the country who were there, and he and his assistant decided to help this one guy, and they got him out. And so he turned to the assistant, and he said, "You take him, go." And there was another voice that they had heard, and the assistant left with this other man, and then all of a sudden he realized that Captain Stack wasn't with him. So he turned around, and when he turned around, he saw him on his knee, holding on to the injured person, probably giving him his last rites. And as the man was looking there, and as he looked, the building collapsed and they were both killed. And it's really chilling to read this description, because this man could have just walked out and said, I got to get other people, I got to do this, there's so much going on, I've got to figure out what I'm doing. And instead, he got down, he kneeled to give comfort to somebody else who was in a terrible situation. And this has become a famous story. So this funeral yesterday was packed. De Blasio was there. There were these cars, these fire trucks with long ladders that were holding up an American flag. And it was very, if you see pictures, it's very honest when you see the pictures. And I'm bringing this up because on this question of how do you transform people, I think what we have to realize when we're organizing people is that a significant percentage of people that we talk to have within them the kernel of this kind of, the potential for this kind of piety. Lynn was talking a few weeks ago when John actually asked him, how do you arouse people for a mission to fight as if they're fighting a war, except there's no enemy. The only enemy is the backwardness. You're fighting against the bad to create good, but there's no identified physical enemy like Russia or Nazi Germany or something, but you're just fighting for the good. How do you do it? And Lynn said, you do it by recruiting people to help other people. And obviously, there's a residue within our population among doctors, nurses, school teachers, to some degree still, often first responders, firemen, people who stand on the line of fire, to dedicate their life to doing something meaningful for other people, machine tool operators, the crane operators who spent weeks and weeks and weeks cleaning up the rubble. I spoke to a guy like that the other day. It's an unforgettable experience in somebody's life to have spent 3 months cleaning up the rubble at 9/11. And I think that what we have to do is we have to do a somewhat of an adjustment to realize that within the New York, New Jersey area population, there really is a wellspring, a residue of this kind of depth, which is very relevant to the subject of the Requiem composition by Mozart. And think of ourselves as pulling upon this, drawing this out, bringing this in as the factor that's really, in some sense, going to heal a lot of this insanity that we've lived in since the cover-up of the Kennedy assassination, which is indifference, cruelty, not caring about other people, that this can be swept away by pulling on this residue, which has this beautiful universal quality, and allowing it to come alive because of the music, that the music must bring this alive, like you always talk about the bones, that this is what we have to do. But I think this story, obviously something is going on in the New York area population on this 15th anniversary. A lot of people are actually thinking about it. So I just wanted to add that.
So Patrick, this will be our final question discussion today.
Good afternoon. I'm Patrick from America. I attended a funeral in West Palm Beach, Florida, Saturday, the 11th of June. While I was there, I printed up 250 leaflets of the 28 pages and everything that is present. And I went to probably a half a dozen fire departments, figuring, this would have an impact. And not one of them would let me talk or even leave literature. And I says, geez, this is weird. And I could understand it with Sarasota, with all the hijackers. And so they really went to all the public places and government, told them no soliciting and any kind of politics or whatever. So here I have 250 of these things, and there's like about 4 leaflets in one packet. And meanwhile, I'm going back and forth to the funeral, and at the funeral, I met a doctor that was on the medical staff at the Veterans Hospital in West Palm Beach. And I gave him some of the material and stuff, and he says, geez, I didn't know anything about this. And I said, no, because it's been kept a secret. He goes, okay, well, what do you want me to do? I says, I want you to take all the leaflets I have and just spread the word, because we could do something. And it's the people, not the politicians. So he thanked me, and he says, no problem, we can, get this stuff out. So I was happy because, I did something good. But hold on one second. My niece and her family went to Orlando, Disney World or Land or whatever it is. And at the same time this happened. So it was kind of like, really scary. And I was just thinking back that I think it was in the 60s when I went to Cape Canaveral, Florida, Orlando. And I was just remembering all the excitement of these gigantic rockets. And, so this was replaced by Disneyland. I mean, anyway, it's over. But my last report, which I think you'll really enjoy. Now, when I got on the plane, all right, I'm dressed in my best military outfit, with the pins and stuff. And see, they don't really hassle veterans. So anyway, I'm thinking of a way to get in touch with the pilots. So I'm thinking, well, I have this material, and if I approach them, I'm either taken off the plane and miss my flight. So I said, I prayed. I said, Lord, how can I relay this message? So he put me, for some reason, they changed my seat. And my seat was in the back of the plane. You couldn't go any further. I was next to the bathroom. And there was, so I met one of the flight attendants, Tom, and it was his birthday. So I was kind of talking with him, and I told him about the 28 pages, and he says, yeah, I've heard of it, but, I'm not really. I said, well, I got some stuff that would really, catch your attention. He goes, all right. So I went back to my seat, got some literature, and he's reading it, and he's like giving out, working at the same time, and he's going, my God, this is what happened? I said, yeah, that's why they kept it a secret. And I says, look, I don't want to get you in trouble, so I'm going to cut it short. I have a bunch of these, which I'll give you. And then you could give them to the pilots. This way the pilots know what you know now. And he said, fantastic. I said, okay. I wished him a happy birthday. And then, I saluted the pilots, said, great job. And I'm in New York now. That was my my trip to Disney or Florida. Thank you.
All right, so just in closing, I think in a sense, I lost sound. I'm not going to yell. I think what Renee expressed should make very clear to everyone here why it is in Manhattan that we are going to win this fight. So I would just urge everyone to remember what Mrs. LaRouche said about the moment of tension. This is not like every other moment. We don't have time, but the reason and the Hamiltonian tradition and legacy of New York City are on our side, and we should go out and, as was said earlier, have a lot of fun and be victorious.
Welcome.